I had a stepfather named Jim Flood, and his sister sent me his sister was always taking courses at school after retiring as a school teacher in Pittsburgh for 40 years. And she would continue going to Osher, you know, the Osher program of continuing adult education at Carnegie Mellon. She sent me a letter telling me that she had discovered that Graham Greene's authorized biographer had written about my parents. Her brother, who was my stepfather, he was a young Foreign Service officer who took the mistress away from an older British man whose wife was in England, who was called back home by his employer. And I read this description of my parents in this second volume of 3 volumes on Graham Greene, and it describes my mother and my stepfather and my father, and it says that the story of Jim Flood's marriage was the gossip of the Rue Catinat, and Greene had heard of it. And he also talks about my mother. He says that, it says, hearsay has it that the attaché, who was supposedly my father, went home to his wife and children. He never had children. So it's a long story. Some mistakes here, errors, and paid his pregnant girlfriend $300 before leaving. So this was my mother, that he's talking about my mother. Hello, my mother. You're saying that my mother was paid $300 for getting pregnant or not getting pregnant or just go away for $300? That's not my mother. My mother, nobody can pay her off. Nobody could pay off my mother. And so I had to find out what happened in Saigon. And so I had to find out. I got the Foreign Service list, and I found people who were working with my stepfather, who was dead, in Saigon in French Indochina in 1950, 51, 52, 53. I found 5 CIA officers, and 2 of them were close friends of his, and I asked the CIA if he worked for them, and or if they had any relationship at all, off and on, or for a while, and they refused, and I appealed, and they refused to tell me. And so that doesn't mean that he didn't work for the CIA office as an officer. So I found about 24 people who were, including wives and people who knew them, and I got the story. I found out what happened, and I needed to know if my father loved my mother. I needed to know if I was a one-night stand or what, and I wasn't. And I found out that he loved her. So that made me feel better. I was alarmed, and I wrote to this guy, Norman Cherry, who has just recently died, Norman Cherry. And I found several errors, so I wonder, just for one paragraph, so many errors in one paragraph, and how many errors could there be in the 3 volumes? This guy was not a trained journalist, and so I went to town. I really had to find out everything, and I did. I found out a better story than that was in The Quiet American, actually. I think The Quiet American is a boring little story compared to the real story of what happened.